had men who felt there was an immediate danger to the country. They felt they had a responsibility to act, and having felt this responsibility, did act.
From Washington, NPAC presents a special report on the United States Senate's investigation of the FBI. Now here is NPAC correspondent Paul Duke.
Good evening. This was the FBI's day before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Associate Deputy FBI Director James Adams sat for 3 hours in the witness chair, answering a long series of questions about the Bureau's domestic surveillance operations. Adams acknowledged the agency went too far in its efforts to destroy Dr. Martin Luther King. He conceded there had been abuses of constitutional rights, that the agency under J. Edgar Hoover had ventured into questionable areas where it had no business, that there were instances of unjustified persecution. But Adams also defended the FBI, including part of its investigation of Dr. King, saying it was necessary to check on possible communist influences. And while conceding the abuses, he contended the vast majority of FBI intelligence and counterintelligence work has been legal. At the same time, Adams repeatedly pleaded for Congress to lay down new legal guidelines for the agency, spelling out in specific language just what the FBI's intelligence function is and should be. Tonight, here on public television, we'll again give you the highlights of the testimony and the questioning. Afterward, we'll round out the day's developments with a discussion featuring the observations of Nicholas Horrock, investigative reporter for the New York Times, and Sanford Unger, Washington editor for the Atlantic Monthly, whose book on the FBI will be published soon. From the outset today, it was plain that much of the interrogation would revolve around the committee's disclosures yesterday of the attempts to discredit Dr. King, an intensive campaign that was waged over a 7-year span. The hand of Hoover was everywhere in the harassment of Dr. King. Adams told of 25 separate acts, acknowledging there was no legal basis for any of them. As we pick up the proceedings, Adams is being questioned about an anonymous letter sent to Dr. King in 1964, shortly before he received the Nobel Peace Prize, a letter which some suggest was an attempt to induce suicide. Democratic Chairman Frank Church quoted directly from the letter.
King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do this. Exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. You are done. There is but one way out for you. Now, if you had received such a letter, how would you have interpreted it? What would you have thought it meant?
I have read that statement. I have heard the conclusions of your staff that it was a suicide urging. I can't find any basis upon which they drew that conclusion. I think that approaching it from an objective standpoint, as I read it, I don't know what it means. I think rather than a conclusion, it should be a speculation in a realm of possibilities as to what was intended. But I cannot, I don't understand the basis for it. It's a possibility, but I certainly would not reach such a conclusion from my reading of that statement.
Now, if you had received a letter of this kind, and it had been directed to you, and you were in Dr. King's position, and you read, King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. Now, that happens to roughly correspond to the time before which he was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. What would you think that meant?
I would have to consider what I was being accused of. I would have to consider what the facts were. I would have to consider what the intent of the person was. Writing such a note coming just before Christmas, I don't know if it means is an urging to repent from something this person, whoever he was that sent it. I have no idea what it means.
Certainly no Christmas card, is it?
It's certainly no Christmas card.
It reads, "You are done. There is but one way out for you." What does that mean?
I don't know. I don't know if it means confession. I don't know if it means suicide, as has been raised. I have no idea. You have the statement. I'm not in a position to say. I haven't interviewed anyone that was with him at the time he received it.
Would you disown this statement and say that any connection the FBI had with it was utterly improper and grotesque?
I certainly would say it was improper, and I can't justify its being prepared or sent. Yes, sir.
I gather that there was never any question raised about whether Dr. King was a communist. That was never charged.
Not as a Communist Party member.
Right,
no,
that's
sir.
right. Never a member. Or that he was about or had committed acts of violence.
No.
All right. But the peg for investigating was apparently that he was subject to communist influence.
Yes.
Now, what makes that a justified reason for investigating him? Is it a crime to be approached by someone who's a communist?
No.
Well, what is the legal basis for that investigation?
The basis would be the communist influence on him and the effect it would have upon the organization. Would be in connection with our basic investigation of the Communist Party.
Yeah, well, as I understand the law today, it is not a crime to be a member of a communist party.
That's correct.
How can it be a crime to know someone who is a member of the Communist Party?
It isn't.
Well, then how do you investigate something as tenuous as that? What is the basis for it legally?
Well, it falls into the area of, one, the intelligence jurisdiction of the activities of the Communist Party. You have a situation where an individual in an organization, a leader of an organization, efforts are being made to influence him and achieve control over the organization, and it's part of the overall investigation of the party trying to exert this influence as to, are they successful, are they taking over the black movement or the civil rights movement. It's just like we try to make clear in investigations that were more prevalent years ago but still occur in communist influence in labor unions. We try to tell everybody we interview we're not interested in labor matters. We're not trying to inquire into that. We're interested in the effect of the Communist Party on this union.
Mr. Adams, I'm trying to get at the legal basis in this particular case of investigating Dr. King on the grounds that he might be subject to communist influence. Can you cite any legal basis for that, or is it based entirely upon a generalized authority thought to exist in the FBI to investigate, quote, internal security matters?
It would fall also in the presidential directives of investigating subversive activities.
And then the question would return to what authority the president had.
That's right.
For such an order. Now, Dr. King was investigated, among other things, for matters of, I think you call it delicacy. Would that be a basis for investigating an American citizen by the FBI?
No.
Would you say then that those investigations were improper?
I don't believe that there's an allegation that we investigated him for that. I think there were certain byproducts of information that developed, and I think that at a point you had a situation where the tail was wagging the dog, perhaps, but I don't see any basis for such investigation, and I find it very difficult to get into a discussion of this in view of the prohibitions that I think we...
Well, you answered my question. That by itself would not be a basis
No,
for
sir.
justice. Senator Hart.
It is right that the committee and the press be worried about the treatment of a Nobel Prize winner, Dr. King. There were an awful lot of people who never got close to a Nobel Prize, whose name is Jones and Smith, that my review of the file show had violence done to their First Amendment rights. And Nobel Prize winners will always get protection, but Joe Potatoes doesn't. And this committee should focus on him too. Now, included in this Cointelpro were activities like this. Anonymous letters drafted by bureau offices in the field, sent to headquarters in Washington, approved, and then put in the mail, intended to break up marriages. Not of Dr. King, but of Mary and John Jones, because one or other was thought to be a dissenter. Might have dressed strangely, or showed up at meetings in company of others who dressed strangely. Anonymous letters to university officials and to the several newspapers in that city to prevent university facilities from being made available to a speaker whom the Bureau disapproved. And it wasn't a top-flight, big-name speaker. In that case, an anonymous letter was sent to me making protest. As an anonymous letter, it never occurred to me that it came from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The series of anonymous letters, one with the spelling very poor, the grammar sloppy, and another more sophisticated, protesting the employment by a city of a man alleging that he was a communist or came from a communist family, and there are loyal Americans out of work, and what are you doing, Mayor? And to the press, isn't this an outrage? And again, an anonymous letter sent to me, what are you going to do about this? There are loyal Democrats in this town who need work. And in that case, I happen to have known the man about whom the protest was made. And the Bureau's facts were wrong as hell on that man's loyalty. He was as loyal as you or I. Now, yes or no, are those actions regarded now by the Bureau as within bounds?
No, sir.
Why were they regarded as within bounds when they were approved by the Bureau?
Well, I think even under the guidelines of Cointelpro, as established, the programs were not designed for the purpose of harassment of an individual. The memoranda indicate they're designed to disrupt the organization. Some of the turndowns were turned down on this specific wording. This is mere harassment. The rationale would have been, and of course, here I say some of these you've mentioned wouldn't even appear to me to meet the criteria of the program and should have been disavowed even under the existence of the program. However, in the total context of the program, activities were to be directed towards the organization itself, but we do not do that at the present time.
Yeah, but everything I've summarized rather poorly was approved by the Bureau at the time, by headquarters, not field office acts.
I do think that there were improper actions taken under the program, even under the program as it existed. Mr. Kelly has so stated his recognition of that fact. The Attorney General certainly has. Yet the majority of the actions taken, even the Department concluded, were lawful and legal, proper investigative activities. But
you see, my feeling is that it isn't a question of techniques that are bad. The concept of the program seems to do violence to the First Amendment, because everything that you did sought to silence somebody, or frighten somebody into silence, or deny somebody a platform, or create an atmosphere in which people were in fact afraid to assemble. Now, sometimes law enforcement, legitimate law enforcement, has what we call this chilling effect. When it's legitimate law enforcement, oftentimes that chilling effect is a necessary, though regrettable, side effect. But what I'm talking about, and what these files are full of, are actions the only purpose of which is to chill.
Hart's concern reflected the committee's concern that the FBI has systematically disregarded constitutional rights of individuals. Much of this concern is directed at the agency's so-called Cointelpro program, a counterintelligence operation whereby the FBI, over a 15-year period from 1956 to 1971, conducted a dozen separate programs of infiltration and harassment. 7 of these involved domestic groups and organizations, such as militant blacks and New Left political leaders. J. Edgar Hoover approved the COINTEL operations, which included a wide variety of tactics: break-ins, wiretaps, anonymous mailings, dissemination of false information, and the use of informers to disrupt meetings and other activities. The senators pressed Adams for his views on the legal justification for COINTEL. Republican John Tower of Texas led the questioning in trying to find out more about the operations.
You've been familiar with the Bureau's domestic intelligence work for many years. How did the Bureau come to launch the COINTEL program, and what, in essence, did COINTELPRO accomplish?
Well, the program as such, as I can reconstruct from the files, was indicated to concern over the conspiratorial efforts of certain groups, and an attempt to a decision made that perhaps more affirmative action should be taken to neutralize violence, which was becoming of more concern to the FBI in that regard. I believe these are some of the basic considerations that went into the launching of COINTELPRO. Now, as far as the first one, which was the Communist Party, of course, there was a concern here to neutralize the effectiveness of the Communist Party in the United States. In fact, out of all the COINTELPRO operations that were approved, 59% of them were directed at the Communist Party. The bulk of the concern initially was with the Communist Party, and it was a desire to create factionalism within the Communist Party and try to neutralize its efforts. The Communist Party, Congress itself, still has a determination on the record as to the threat of the Communist Party and a statute. The Supreme Court has held that the Communist Party is an instrument of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union certainly has not relinquished its interest in the United States as a target. All of these considerations went into, should we do something not only to follow the activities of the Communist Party, but should we destroy its effectiveness in the United States? That was the first program, I believe, that was initiated.
Now, did the Bureau ever seek direction or counsel from the Attorney General on any of its Cointelpro efforts or specific programs?
As best as I can reconstruct, Senator, there was no direct authority requested from any Attorney General for the initiation of these programs, and it's only a question, as your staff presented yesterday, that the Attorney Generals, Presidents, Congress had been made available of certain aspects of programs after the fact, and those were primarily concerned with the Communist Party and one other organization, but not the New Left and these other types. So I cannot find any evidence that, and I have no reason to believe there would be any evidence that the Bureau initiated these programs other than as an internal decision.
Well, were reports on these programs made to the Attorney General? Was he informed of them? Was he kept informed on a continuing basis?
He was kept informed by letters, which again the staff has and alluded to, letters reporting certain developments. For instance, one of them that went to one Attorney General, reading of that letter outlined almost incomplete detail Klan activities taken to disrupt the Klan. It used terms of neutralize, disrupt. There was a clear explanation of what we were doing against the Klan in that regard.
How is it that you came to believe that you had the authority to neutralize or disrupt these organizations rather than proceed against them frontally through prosecuting them for law violations?
I guess you would have to say in a position like this that it's just like the Smith Act of 1940, which is designed to prevent revolutionary groups from advocating the overthrow of the government, and then subsequent interpretations as to the constitutionality of it leaves us with a statute still on the books that prescribes certain actions, but yet the degree of proof necessary to operate under the few remaining areas is such that there was no satisfactory way to proceed. And it was an area where...
Would the Senator yield at that point, please? What you're saying, Mr. Manal, is that because... Mr. Adams, excuse me, is that you didn't operate within the law because the law didn't give you sufficient latitude. Therefore, you undertook direct action to disrupt and otherwise undermine these organizations.
Did you proceed on the assumption that these organizations would eventually break the law, and therefore you sought to neutralize or disrupt them before they did?
I can't say that, sir. I think that the investigations of them were based on this belief that they might break the law, or they were breaking the law. The disruptive activities, I can't find where we were able to relate it to that. What it boils down to is what we've gotten into question before on, that in our review of the situation, we see men of the FBI recognizing or having a good faith belief that there was an immediate danger to the United States.
All right, but to repair to Senator Church's question, you don't say that you really had specific legal authority for this.
No, and this is the hang-up with the whole program, and which we are not trying to justify that there's some statutory basis. I wouldn't make that effort whatsoever. All I'm trying to do is say that at the time it was initiated, we had men who felt there was an immediate danger to the country. They felt they had a responsibility to act, and having felt this responsibility, did act. And this is the whole problem we have at the present time, because we do have, one, we can see good evidence of their belief there was a threat. We had cities being burned, we had educational institutions being bombed, we had deaths occurring from all of these activities, we had a situation that we didn't know what the end was going to be. We never can look around the corner in intelligence operations. We don't know if ultimately this might bring the destruction of the country. All we know is we had an extremely violent time. So I don't find any basis in my mind to argue with their good faith belief they were faced with a danger. Now, when they move over to this second area of responsibility, here's where we have the problem, and I think it's the whole purpose of this committee, the Attorney General, Mr. Kelly, all of us realizing we can't operate in these areas where we feel a responsibility but we don't have a mandate by Congress. So in that area, this feeling of responsibility, I feel, came from the fact that presidents, as your staff said yesterday, presidents, congressmen, the Attorney General, no one really provided direction and guidance or instructions, don't do this, don't do that, or what are you doing and how are you doing. For instance, there's some feeling on the part of some that our whole domestic intelligence operations were secret. The Cointelpro operation was. I mean, I think we all agreed that this was, to be effective, they felt it should be secret. But back in this is printed appropriation testimony, which went to the members of the committee. It was mailed out to newspapers, friends, anyone that was interested in it. Back in 1970, talking about our internal security operations, the New Left Movement, Young Socialist Alliance, Chicago Trial, nationwide demonstrations, student agitation, anti-war activities, Vince Aramus Brigade, Committee of Returned Volunteers, Communist Party USA, Progressive Labor Party, Socialist Workers Party, extremist organizations, Black Panther Party, all of these items, and statements about extremists, white extremist and hate-type groups, Republic of New Africa, Minutemen, our coverage of subversive organizations. The several groups, organizations, and movements which I've discussed show the wide coverage we must maintain to follow on their activities and changing tactics. In spite of the proliferation of these organizations, our informant coverage at all levels has been of great value and assistance in enabling us to keep abreast of our investigative responsibilities. This is the same way through all of our public appropriation testimony. We've told the world we're investigating black hate groups, new left groups. So I merely mention this to try to put in the frame of reference of these men feeling they know we're investigating them. They didn't tell them, though, in sufficient detail, or other than scantily before the Appropriations Committee, what we were doing to disrupt these activities. And my feeling is that the men recognized the danger. They pointed out the danger to the world. They said we're investigating these organizations, and they felt then that the comfortable climate of leave it up to the FBI, we should do something more. And that's what we're looking for guidelines on. The Attorney General, Mr. Kelly, you, that give us the guidelines under which we should operate. Now, there are certain guidelines that we don't need to be given. We shouldn't do this. We don't have such activities today, programs designed to disrupt or neutralize in the domestic intelligence field. But beyond that, we need guidelines on what does the whole of Congress, representative of the people, by passage of legislation, say this is the FBI's role in domestic intelligence? And that's...
Mr. Chairman, my time is long since expired. I would like to note that I saw Mr. Kelly on the Today Show this morning indicating strong support for responsible congressional oversight, and I
Yes,
think
sir.
that's a healthy attitude.
Well, I think it must come because, as you have really conceded, you shouldn't have ever had to have had guidelines to tell you that the federal government's chief law enforcement agency ought not to disobey the law. And really, you don't need explicit guidelines to tell you that, or you shouldn't have. Wouldn't you agree?
I would say that looking at it today, we should have looked at it that way yesterday. But I do feel that I don't have any doubt about the good faith of people recognizing a danger, feeling they had a responsibility, no matter whose fault it was, ours internally or because we weren't given the supervision we should have been given, and taking what they considered appropriate action.
Would you agree with me, Mr. Adams, that this whole vague, generalized area of the assignment that the FBI has been tasked and which they've thought they possess over the years to investigate Americans, not where there are allegations of crime or suspicions that crimes are about to be committed or that there's violence or that violence is about to be committed, but rather this whole generalized area to investigate Americans in terms of ideas that they have or might be persuaded to have that might hold potential for danger to this country is an exceedingly vague, difficult, if not impossible to define area, and an area which has gotten the FBI into an awful lot of trouble, including today's hearings.
Yes.
And because of that, there is a very important need to sit down and redefine it, have the guidelines known specifically by law, so that the FBI can know precisely what it can do and what it cannot do.
I think this is why the country is fortunate at this particular time to have an Attorney General who is a legal scholar and a lawyer of unquestioned repute, who has indicated a willingness to address these problems, which, as the staff has determined, was not always the case over the years. But we have an Attorney General, we have a Director who has offered his complete cooperation, just as he has to the committee in this inquiry, that we're not trying to avoid embarrassment. The only thing we're trying to hold back are identities of informants and sensitive ongoing operations, and that we have a concern on the part of Congress that not only recognizes there have been abuses, but recognizes that there still always has to be some degree of flexibility. We're going to have situations where you have a weatherman working for the waterworks, and in college he was a scientific student, and he makes a comment that to a fellow employee that there's going to be some spectacular event occurring that's going to bring the attention of the world on this city.
Well, now, wouldn't you have probable cause then to investigate the commission of a crime?
We might have to investigate,
right?
but
because
to
you got
disrupt, do we have the authority to tell the supervisor of the waterworks, you better get him out of there before the city water is poisoned and 100,000 people die? And I think the committee is going to find the same problems we do in groping with that situation, and even the Attorney General in his speech in Ottawa pointed out that there is still possibly a necessity for some flexibility.
The Senate Intelligence Committee and the highlights of today's testimony by Deputy Associate FBI Director James Adams. Let's turn now to our two resident FBI experts, Sandy Unger and Nicholas Horrock. Gentlemen, it seems to me that in his testimony today, threaded throughout his testimony today, Mr. Adams really was sounding a call for help. He was saying that you are very concerned about the way the FBI has been operating, about the misdeeds, the irregularities, the abuses. Well, now tell us how you wish us to operate. Give us some guidelines. Nick, is it possible for Congress to frame guidelines for the FBI to operate?
Oh, I'm anxious just on the word guidelines, and I think we've got to reflect for a minute. We are a nation of laws. Senator Church made a point today, so did Mr. Mondale, that there are laws to deal with situations. He uses the weatherman example. This is a man who's going to poison the water. There is probable cause. You can go to a U.S. attorney. You can bring that man in for questioning. It's very questionable whether you should force him out of employment. And I think it is important for us to figure out if we can't operate within the laws now existing. And I think many members of the committee feel that. Now, there are some operational guidelines on who they should investigate, but not on what Mr. Adams suggests who we should disrupt. I'm not sure that's a matter for guidelines. That's against the law in this country to disrupt people.
Sandy?
It seems to me guidelines has become kind of a code word, Paul. The Justice Department's working on them. The Congress says they want to develop them. The FBI says they want them. It seems to me that one of the important things is to establish some kind of system whereby somebody other than the FBI is involved in deciding whom the FBI is going to investigate. You know, as long as you have an intelligence division of the FBI, they're going to find subversives. They're going to find somebody to keep them busy. And if they, unchecked, without anyone else to consult, or if it's up to them to decide, I'm concerned that today's patriotism may appear tomorrow's subversion if there's nobody else to investigate.
Well, are you suggesting that the Justice Department, for example, should provide more supervision?
Well, some people have suggested that there should be, say, an inspector general in the Justice Department who reviews the premises on which the FBI is operating. I think one of the problems that flows out of what Nick was saying is that if Congress starts writing very specific guidelines, starts getting too specific about it, there may be First Amendment problems. The Congress may be specifying activity which should be investigated, or speech which should be investigated.
But Sandy, if you adopt your suggestion of having an inspector general, for example, wouldn't that man have awesome power, and wouldn't you be paving the way for some future J. Edgar Hoover?
Well, that's
in
obviously
part true, but they let it go so long that maybe the FBI building's symbolic. The FBI exceeds the size of the Justice Department in its power and its sense. I mean, it's a giant building downtown. I think the Justice Department has to take it back into its original role. It is an investigative arm of the Department of Justice. If the department says there's a crime and it wants it investigated, it directs the FBI to do so. And I think that Attorney General Levy and his successors have got to bring that back into reality here, that they should serve the department.
How effective was Adams as a witness? Was he forthright? Did he tell everything he knew?
Well, he's obviously an articulate man. He had a grasp of some of what he was doing. He quite cleverly deplored and rejected the most severe things that were done against Martin Luther King, which I think was obviously important for him to do. I think there may be some other areas where he was less than forthcoming and less than candid. I think that, for example, to say that informants never disrupt or never act as provocateurs is to read the rules as they exist in the Bureau.
As a matter of fact, there are cases open. They used informants in Washington to do a burglary, and they're being sued for it, to steal materials. Agents in other cities have used informants to enter apartments and place things in apartments and leave. Very few of these cases. I mean, he says a few, but I don't recall personally any case where they prosecuted an informant of their own. I'm sure there are some, but they certainly don't stand out in your mind.
Why was he chosen to be the FBI spokesman and not the director of the FBI, Clarence Kelly?
I think there are probably a few reasons for that, Paul. I don't think Mr. Kelly has been looking at these things in quite the detail Mr. Adams has.
I think there's a little politics, too. As you may know, Mr. Kelly was before Senator Eastland today on terrorism. He would not go off of his terrorism presentation to any questions on this matter. It's very strange that the director of the FBI isn't before the church committee and instead an underling. And I talked to a lot of on the Hill today who thought maybe Kelly had neatly avoided that problem and sent Mr. Adams.
Now, I'm sure he wasn't. I'm sure Kelly was not eager to address some of these issues by any means, and I think that in many respects, in choosing Adams, the Bureau is putting its best foot forward. That he is a well-rehearsed, well-practiced congressional witness who does a pretty good job at confronting the senators.
He also was a man who knew J. Edgar Hoover rather well, and one of the intriguing things to me, at least, was that he could not give any real answer explaining Hoover's bias toward Martin Luther King.
That's right. He said on several occasions he just would not discuss the matter of motive. Now, I think there are probably several reasons for that. Nick and I may disagree about it, but I think one of them was that Adams simply was not going to be put into a position of criticizing J. Edgar Hoover publicly. And I think there's no secret that Mr. Adams is somebody who would like one day to be director of the FBI, and one does not become director of the FBI by publicly criticizing J. Edgar Hoover. He is still a god to many people.
Mr. Adams used a very interesting word, though, in avoiding discussing this question on King. He used the word delicate. And I think that within the Bureau, they felt that Hoover's feelings about King stemmed possibly from racial bigotry, which we were talking about last night, but partly from Hoover's sense that King's mores were terribly unsuitable for a leader in this country. I don't believe that there's any, standpoint that is correct, and I'm not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting that Hoover had a strange Victorian sense of mores and had decided to use that against King. And I think that's one thing that Mr. Adams didn't want to get into in public, is the attitudes that Hoover expressed privately about King's personal life.
One of the things that was brought out yesterday was the disclosure that the FBI had a stand-in for King in the wings, that if they could somehow knock King from his pedestal, that then this man would step forward and become the new Martin Luther King. Do either of you know who that person was?
Well, I have some leads on it, Paul, but I don't know myself at this point. Apparently, it's somebody who's very obscure, who was quite surprised himself when he found out.
Obviously,
apparently
not a
he was
national
not
figure.
approached. Also, in other words, this was somebody they'd selected on reputation
and on paper,
and he'd never been approached about his.
Now, Adams also claimed today that the FBI, by and large, was above board in its dealings with the press, that it dealt honestly with newspapermen and television correspondents. Have you found that to be true?
I think they've been one of the greatest manipulators of the press in Washington, and were, when I first came here, enormously so. They had a habit, for instance, of what they called friendlies, and I once worked for an organization that was well regarded by the Bureau, of giving you private briefings, which were quite advantageous over your competitors, but sometimes dangerously contained inaccurate information, and you could be badly used if you ran with it right away. They knew how to reward the press that was favorable to them, and as we learned today, to no-comment publications that Mr. Hoover decided were going to criticize him. And it was a very effective. One of the cases was New Haven. You may recall in, I guess it was 1970, Kent State weekend, there was a demonstration in New Haven. And several members of the press were told by friends of theirs in the Bureau that there were guns being brought in the city. And we were given a terribly strong idea of what would happen. None of that happened. We later determined, by comparing notes, that we had been the victims of a kind of a Cointelpro, the hope of reducing the number of crowds if we wrote stories of terrible violence coming forth. I think several of us were lucky that our stories didn't get in. But
Sandy, you've just written a book about the FBI. How cooperative is the FBI today?
Well, I think some of these things have changed, Paul. I think the Bureau is learning that everybody can't be classified as a friend or an enemy the way they once did. Although, I must say, they still resort to a few tricks. Why, back about a year ago, when some of the first things were coming out about Cointelpro and the Bureau was concerned about what was being said, they issued on plain white paper to some reporters they thought they could trust a few of the Bureau's answers in the hope that this would get into the stories, not indicating at all that it had come from the FBI. I've found on my project, which has spanned over a period of 2 years, that many of the younger people in the Bureau are really quite eager to be cooperative, to talk about what they do, to explain that it's not everybody who's in security work, and to talk about how they feel about the organization. They've, in the past, always demanded the right to review things that people wrote with Bureau cooperation. In my case, I made no such promise, and I've had their cooperation without having to submit any manuscript to them later. So I think that some things are changing anyway.
I think we also ought to point out that a substantial number of agents didn't agree with a good many things that went on in Hoover's Bureau.
That's right.
And some of them laid their jobs on the line and were badly treated even after leaving the Bureau because they opposed him. And you cannot say that of the 8,000, or is it 8,500 agents they have now, that they were all eager to break the law.
I had, in fact, Paul, last night, after we reviewed yesterday's testimony, I had a call from one agent I know who said, look, I can tell you I never broke the law while working for the FBI. And this was a small number of people who were engaged in some of these activities, and especially people that Hoover knew he could count upon at headquarters, who helped dream up these ideas and who were especially active in doing this. Most agents, I think, many agents anyway, prefer criminal investigations.
Certainly.
That's what they'd like to be in.
Senator Hart raised a crucial question today, it seems to me. He was suggesting that someone like Martin Luther King or someone of his eminence could survive the kind of harassment which they receive from the FBI. But what about the average Joe Potatoes?
I think he's in trouble. I did a story once on a professor, Starsky, at the University of Arizona, who was a victim of Cointelpro because he was in the Socialist Workers' Party. And it took him years to find out what happened to him, because they wrote a letter to the academic board. His academic accreditation was threatened, and he really didn't know where it came from. He didn't have the facilities of people in Washington, as Mr. King did, who finally told him, you're a victim of the Bureau.
That's right. And when you look back over Mr. Adams' testimony today, he disavowed what was done to Martin Luther King, but he was unrepentant on many other areas. He did not say that the Bureau should not have investigated various other people, should not have done some of the things it did to lower-level people in civil rights groups in the South, for example. And he was given the opportunity to disavow more than he did, and he held back from doing it.
Well, that's certainly true. Do you think that during this period the FBI really had a hang-up about communism, or was it reflecting the temper of the times? Weren't there members of Congress, for example, who really secretly applauded many of the things which the FBI was doing?
Well, to some extent that's true. Mr. Adams listed off those groups that were in Mr. Hoover's appropriations testimony, and it was right there on the record. They said they were investigating these people. I think that as far as the Communist Party was concerned, certainly at the beginning, in the early years of what the Bureau was doing to the Communist Party, many people would have applauded them. I think maybe the Bureau
did applaud them, really. In fact, McCarthy was both a friend of the Bureau's and they were a friend of his. They supplied him information and he supplied them accolades.
It may just be that the Bureau sort of lagged behind the times a bit, that they continued doing this a long time after there was really public support.
That may be a political sense, by the way, and you notice that Hoover finally, about 1966 and 67, begins to get a sense that this country's attitudes are changing. And the reason they've gotten into their worst trouble is the late portion of Cointelpro. The stuff in the 69, 70, 71 is because, just like the Vietnam War, the people didn't want that any longer, and that's when it began to run into serious trouble, even before the recent exposures, suits and other kinds of cases.
Did you find Adams persuasive in arguing that law enforcement agencies must always maintain huge dossiers, large files, collect all kinds of information, even if a lot of it is invaluable?
Well, I think there are some real flaws in that argument.
Right.
The problem is that if there's a false allegation about you, Paul, in the FBI files, even if it's shown to be false, it remains there to be called up time and again if you're ever named to a job which requires that you be investigated. And I think that's too bad. Why should the false allegation be brought up again?
Funniest, not funny, so struck the humorous chord with a reporter several months ago was that Mr. Kelly once explained to a House committee that they couldn't destroy it because of the archives law, which prohibits the destruction of certain government documents. But they're clearly on very weak ground there, and they haven't really scrubbed their computers, as I understand it.
Let's move ahead 5 to 10 years and ask the question, could it happen again? Could there be new movements, more dissent in this country that could revive all of this once more? Nick?
Yes, I think it could happen any time. I think that kind of a reversal is what the church committee has got to deal with. It's got to work out some way of protections in the future so that we don't have things like, for example, the Baltimore women's liberation movement being investigated and infiltrated by the FBI, and that's where we're coming back to our guideline situation, or our laws.
Whatever the guidelines, Paul, I think it's often going to depend on the people. And as long as you have, say, Richard Nixon in the White House and John Dean as White House counsel and John Mitchell as Attorney General or J. Edgar Hoover as FBI Director, the guidelines might not mean anything. And many of the same people are still in the Bureau now, could be in the Bureau 5 or 10 years from now. And if they're offended then by Beards and nonconformity and the people at Antioch College or women's lib groups, why not?
So it could happen again.
That's right.
That's what we agree on, unfortunately. Well, talking about the Baltimore episode involving the women there, the senators today certainly did not overlook the women's lib disclosure in their questioning. Senator Church chided the FBI and Mr. Adams for concentrating its energy on what he viewed as a disgraceful example of muddle-headed monitoring of legitimate citizen activity. His real concern was that the names of the women would remain forevermore in those FBI files as innocent victims of domestic spying.
Now in a case of this kind, what do you do do you still carry, you say this has been closed. Apparently the women's liberation movement is no longer under suspicion by the FBI. And the case has been closed. What happens when the case is closed? Are those women's names still left in the files? Are they forevermore contained in the
Yes.
in the system? Yes. There's no yes.
Yes.
Pretty soon you'll have us all in the system. I mean, if there's no way even after surveillance has been terminated, to terminate the references of individuals through the files of the system, you'll one day have us all, won't you?
Well, I would say that as part of a normal business record, when we do make a judgment that an organization should be investigated, and we investigate it, and then we find activities, but we make a conclusion that there's no additional problem here, this is a record of our official action. Now, if we destroy it, at what point do we get into a situation of being accused of doing things and then destroying things to keep from showing what we do?
But
now, the critical thing on this is whether we are able, we do set up safeguards where information in our files is not misused at a later date, and that's what these guideline committees are all about.
Well, can you have you any idea how many names of Americans you keep in your files all told as a result of the cumulative effect of all these surveillances and investigations?
No, I don't.
You don't. It's in the millions, isn't it?
We have 6.5 million files.
You have 6.5 million files.
Yes, sir.
And there are surely names of more than one person typically in a file, aren't there?
But it is a rather large country. We have
well, that's a large number of files to start with, and if you have multiple names in them, we're quickly up into the 20, 30, 40 million.
Right, but many of these files are applicant files. They're not all subversive files. They're not all criminal files. We have 1 million crimes of violence each year. There's 1 million people.
Sure, and I wish you had more time to spend on those crimes of violence.
I do too.
Well, there we're agreed.
Right.
What I worry about is this. You say there's no way to know when to close a file. These are surveillance files. They were originally opened up to determine whether organizations might have subversive connections. There are names in these files, so some demagogue comes along and says against some public figure that his name is contained in a certain file that is to be found in the subversive files of the FBI. And there it is. He hasn't made a misstatement at all, but to the American people, that man's name and reputation has been scarred.
And I hope this committee recognizes that and recommends legislation that would enforce strong punitive or criminal violations against misuse of information in the files. We feel this way, CIA feels this way. We recognize we have a lot of sensitive information in it. We fire our employees if we find them misusing information. We feel we need additional sanctions in this area. I don't think we can ever stop the accumulation of information. I don't know an investigative agency in the world, a law enforcement agency, that doesn't have to accumulate information. And we're working on guidelines as to how to get rid of the irrelevant information, how to eliminate material that really doesn't need to be kept. And we hope we'll be able to come to Congress with these guidelines before too long, which will help address itself to just some of these problems.
Well, you may be assured that the committee shares your objective in this regard, and we will be working with you and with the Department of Justice and others to try and change the laws to give a greater measure of protection to the First Amendment rights of the American people.
Tomorrow, the Senate committee turns its attention back to the investigation of the Central Intelligence Agency and will release its long-awaited report on political assassinations. The report is expected to provide some important new details about American attempts to undermine certain foreign governments and their leaders. The White House has been deeply concerned about the report and has tried to prevent its release. Today, CIA Chief William Colby called a news conference to protest the report's inclusion of a dozen names, all persons affiliated with the CIA in some fashion, and all implicated to some degree in the assassination stories. Colby suggested there could be retaliation by what he called certain irrational groups, with U.S. intelligence efforts damaged in the process. Tonight, President Ford himself has made a personal appeal to the committee to delete the names. The committee previously agreed to drop some names, but Chairman Church is saying it will stand firm against any more deletions, accusing the White House of an 11th-hour attempt to scuttle the committee's overall investigation. So, as it now stands, the Senate meets tomorrow morning in an unusual closed session to take up the assassination report, and we'll be back tomorrow night here on public television with a special program to give you the full particulars. For Sanford Unger and Nick Horrock, I'm Paul Duke saying good night from Washington. Washington.
This program was produced by NPAC, a division of WETA, which is solely responsible for its content, and was funded by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.